And thank you very much, and we will immediately start to the next and the last session 40, the future of the G20, charting a path for global governance. It will be jointly with T20, and our moderator will be Mr. Ussal Shahbaz. He is the director of T20, Think 20, and our panelists are Mr. Muhtar Kent from Coca-Cola Company, Chairman and CEO of the Coca-Cola Company, Chair B20 International Business Advisory Council, Mr. Marcus Wallenberg, Chairman Skandinaviska Enskilda Banken from Sweden, Mr. Amar Bachatharya, Senior Fellow Brookings Institution, and finally, Mr. Alexander Shokin, President, Russian Union of Industrialized and Entrepreneurs. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we start the final session, and we are ready. Thank you. We are ready to listen our final panelists. And the panel will discuss the fundamental questions about G20, the future of G20.
Forms chiseled out of stone by masterful hands for hundreds of years in Anatolia shape life with the same rhythm. The matchless visual aesthetic of cultural wealth takes shape in masterly hands. Artistic finesse, handed down from one generation to another, is safeguarded with endless patience and deep respect. Skillful hands processing iron, copper, wood, and cloth also touch the chords of hearts with the same perfection, strengthening spiritual heritage. The works of art, each of which having gained shape through the inalienable principles of their respective traditions, become more meaningful owing to the importance attached to humans.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind
the Anatolian entrepreneurs who produce with a special knack for perfection in hundreds of fields are today indebted to this tradition which centers around humankind's happiness. The source of the respectability that Turkish entrepreneurs enjoy in the world is this very tradition laced with finesse and grace. Building civilization is building happiness.
And two final notes about tablets, Vestel tablets. You can get your Vestel delegate kit, which means they are tablets. You can get them from the delegate zone after 5:30 p.m. today. And the other note, if you still don't have identification badges, name cards, please apply to registration desks to get your IDs and name tags. And the latest and the final note, our dinner and the reception will start at 7 p.m. You can also enjoy Alaturka Street and you can see, you can watch, you can follow whirling dervishes during the dinner. And then we could have a chance to listen former Deputy Prime Minister Mr. Ali Babacan and Deputy Prime Minister Cevdet Yılmaz during the dinner tonight. Thank you. Buyurun Ünsal Bey.
Sağ olun. So welcome everyone. This is a very special session organized jointly by the Business 20 and Think 20. I have two badges today, one for Business 20 and one for Think 20. I lead the content side of Business 20 and also the Think 20 network this year. We have very distinguished panelists. Before introducing them, let me also briefly talk about what Think 20 is doing. Think 20 is a later started engagement group to the G20. We started 2 years after Business 20. And basically it's a network of think tanks in G20 countries that provide policy ideas to the G20 leaders. So we have today Amar Bhattacharya representing T20. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we have three distinguished representatives of the business community. Mr. Muhtar Kent, I'm not telling their business titles, but the B20 titles. He is the chairman of the newly established International Business Advisory Council of B20. Mr. Markus Wallenberg is this year, he is the co-chair of the Financing Growth Task Force. And Mr. Alexander Shokin is the chair of the B20 Russia 2 years ago. So I'll get 2 rounds of questions and answers, and then if we have time, I'll open to questions from the floor. Amar, let me start with you since this is a joint panel with the Think 20. You probably hold the record of being involved in the G20 meetings since 1999. So you are the best person to evaluate the performance of the group up until now. What would you say about that?
Thank you, Sal. A pleasure to be here. Thanks to those of you who have the stamina to stay for this last session, but I promise you it will be good. If you look at the G20, it has been formed by 2 crises, but it is forged, if you think about it, by some important underlying structural factors that shape the global economy right now. So at the finance ministers level, the G20 was formed by the Asian financial crisis, and those of you who are historical, persons would be interested to know that it actually didn't start as the G20. It started as something called the G22. Briefly, it was the G26. For one meeting, it was the G33. And in 1999, we had the formation of what is now the G20 and the Financial Stability Board. At the time, there were 2 issues that were very much on the table. One was dealing with the financial crisis of the time, which was seen as an emerging market crisis, and indeed the role was to get emerging markets up to the standards of the advanced economies. And the second issue on the table was globalization. If you remember the protests at Seattle, the questioning of globalization, that was a very important issue. Gradually, the G20 finance ministers became also very centrally involved in the discussion of global economic imbalances. But that group had its ups and downs and really did not grapple with the same force and with the same breadth as what we have today. The G20 at the leaders level came about in 2008, and the first 3 meetings actually focused on the crisis. There were 3 issues at the time on the G20: the dealing with the crisis and re-establishing the foundations of growth, repairing and building more resilient financial systems, and the third was reforming the international financial institutions. All things that have remained. But if you think about it, actually, there were some important underlying structural factors that were important then and that remain important now. The first is that there have been massive shifts in the global economy. And the fundamental shifts, of course, is a broadening of global role in the world economy from the G7 to a much wider set of countries. Today, despite the financial crisis, emerging markets and developing countries still are driving 70 to 75% of global growth. So there has been a big shift in the global structure, and that, of course, will continue. The second important driving factor is growing interconnectedness, not just in trade, finance, and investment, but also, as we heard from the President today, in new areas like migration. Some for the good, some for the bad. So there are lots of new issues of interconnectedness, but there is no doubt that the world is getting more interconnected right now. A third important structural driver in the global economy right now is governments still remain in charge, but we live now in a multi-stakeholder world. The business sector, and this meeting represents the very fact that you can't just confine these discussions now to governments alone. It's very important to include governments, it's very important to include labor, it's very important to include civil society, and ultimately, yes, citizens. So we live in a multi-stakeholder world. And the fourth factor is collective actions today don't map very well with the architecture of international institutions. The institutions that were created in the post-World War II era remain very important, but if you look at the challenges that we face, you can't simply assign them to the existing institutions of the world. So in that context, the G20 plays three important potential roles. First, it is the crisis manager of the world. Every time that there is a problem, who does the world think about? No longer the G7, it's the G20. Second, the G20 is the strategic driver now of the global economic and financial agenda. It really sets the directions because, as I said, there isn't a single other institution to do that. And third, it is a gap filler. Where there aren't mechanisms to respond very quickly, the G20 steps into the gap and fills the gap. Now, how well has it done that? The answer is, if you like giving grades as a professor, maybe a B-. So why do I say that? Because ultimately the G20 has actually delivered very well after the global financial crisis, but increasingly it has run into headwinds, and these headwinds are created by the fact that we still live in a very fragmented world, despite the fact that the agenda is very interconnected. The European crisis was a European crisis, but the G20 helped, in some sense, ensure that it didn't become a global crisis. We have today a high level of idiosyncratic risk. Everybody says emerging markets are in trouble, but if you look behind it, you will find that individual emerging markets are in trouble. The problems are more related to national problems rather than global problems. But what we find in that context is these national problems spill over. And the job of the G20, of course, is to address those problems. So the G20 has done a reasonable job of not slipping back into recession, but it hasn't gotten us out of the confidence problem that has plagued the global economy since 2008. The G20 has done, in my view, an excellent job of building up financial rules that do learn from the financial crisis and before, but it has not done a perfect job of implementing that into ground level decisions right now. And finally, with regard to international financial institutions, we have still a very unfinished agenda with regard to IMF, World Bank, and need a broader institutional reform. And as we heard from the discussions of the B20, there are many other issues that have come to the fore. It's great that they have come to the fore, but the implementation of this will be the challenge of the day. So on the whole, the G20 is, if we didn't have the G20, we would invent it. It has done, in my view, a reasonable job of tackling the issues, but because we still live in a world of imperfect cooperation and segmented countries, we are still not able to have the G20 with the force and the power that is needed for the global economy.
Thank you, Amar. Thanks for setting the stage. Let me turn to the business community now. Mr. Marcus Wallenberg, you are heavily involved in the ICC, which is the largest representation of the global business. And Amar actually pictured how the global context is changing and how G20 is evolving from a crisis committee to a steering committee. How does the business see G20's role as a steering committee of the global economy?
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. Great context. Being a Swede, which is not part of the G20, it's great to be commenting on this organization. I think that Amar, as you said, set the stage extremely well. But I would like to say that, if I may just add one issue around what's going on right now in the economic setting. And that is that since the financial crisis started, I think we've seen a dramatic development in new technologies, which has now entered into the global scene. I'm saying this because if you should assess what has been going on since the financial crisis started and the work of the G20 has been going on, I believe that you can ask yourself that traditionally we have seen in business cycles the fact that when low interest rates, low commodity prices, low petroleum or energy prices has usually been a fantastic position for investing more into the businesses that you have. So the question is, of course, why is not business then investing at this point in time? I think that this technological revolutionary situation that is going on, if you look at businesses such as life sciences and the impact of the digital economy on many of the traditional businesses, has actually pushed the way the entrepreneurs and the businesses think about their investment levels. And investment is a very big part of, in my view, the reason why we're not, the lack of investments is that we don't get the economic wheels to turn. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the G20, when we look upon the result of the actions of G20, then also we should understand that there has been a fundamental change around which businesses think about their markets, the technologies, and we read every day about the disruptive technologies coming into play. I say this because one of the issues, when we think about the G20, at least from a business point of view, I think about it a little bit like a quarterback trying to pass the ball in different directions to certain institutions to try to deal with the crisis at hand. The number of questions that are now being dealt with are so many and so complicated that we are really having a problem, I think, to set all the policies or all the different, if I may put it that way, practical solutions at the level of the G20. So for the future, perhaps one way of attacking a lot of the problems that we're now seeing is that G20 in its governance structure becomes even more effective in pushing responsibilities down to those institutions on a global basis that are there today to solve them. If you think about issues like world trade, which I happen to believe is also a fundamental gearing towards this question, you can ask yourself if the WTO has really received clear enough instructions and clear enough mandate to solve a lot of the trade issues that we're grappling with. It was fantastic that the trade facilitation agreement came to play, but actually it is only part of the failure that we've seen from the lack of a Doha round that was so much needed for international or multilateral trade as we saw it before. So perhaps one should think about, in the future, more about how to govern the G20 and how one implements the policy changes going forward.
Thank you. So now we heard how the global context is evolving, how the global business is adopting to the evolving global context, particularly the changes in the technology. Let me turn to Mr. Shokin now. You have been involved in this, for a long time, and you were the chair of B20. How do you see the key achievements of the G20?
First of all, I would like to thank
if you could speak up a bit.
Organizers for invitation to be here in this panel. As I understand, I was invited as a chair of B20 Russia 2013, and of course it's absolutely obvious that G20 and B20 achieved positive results. Of course, we are speaking mostly about the G20 as a summary institution, because it's absolutely sure that G20 was established in 1999. I would like to mention a few achievements and successes. First of all, members country delivery on the promise to boost the IMF lending resources to support growth. G20 members' assessment and coordination of economic policies for reducing imbalances. Advancement of fundamental reform of the financial system in partnership with Financial Stability Board. Consensus of flexibility in fiscal strategies implementation. Endorsement and launch of BEPS action plan. I remember that BEPS action plan was signed in St. Petersburg 2 years ago. This plan originated by OECD, and now it's one of the tools to have transparency in the taxation and related fields. Also, comprehensive growth strategies and employment plans with close to 1,000 individual structural policy measures, which, according to the OECD assessment, should raise G20 GDP by roughly 2.1% by 2018. But speaking about achievements and successes, I would like to say that institutional development is a very important fact. Over the period of last 8 years, G20 has transformed from a shock-activated anti-crisis steering committee into global governance club, recognized as a new global center of collective leadership. Its institutional strengths include the flexibility combined with established procedures, multiple G20 own institutions, and close engagement with other international organizations, a system of outreach cooperation with non-G20 countries and other partners, business community first of all, and social partners, think tanks, and not last and not least is evolving accountability and self-accountability mechanisms. But at the same time, we see that some challenges and some risks are remaining, and G20 has to resolve these challenges. If you have time, I would like to mention at least 3 risks and challenges. First and most important, G20 has not been able to avert the new crises, like the debt crisis in Europe, I mean Cyprus and Greece, and like migration crisis in the Mediterranean and Europe. Of course, solutions of these problems were found on the regional, inter-regional level, but at the same time, G20 should remain alert to this kind of challenges and new challenges. Second, though the number of the commitments made by G20 has reached the total of 1,511 by now, many issues on the G20 agenda are still work in progress. I would like to mention only two examples. The IMF reform. One example, this reform is not completed in spite of the commitments made by the leaders at every summit since Pittsburgh in 2009. The second example is commitments to fight protectionism measures. Of course, today we already raised this issue, and during IBAC meeting, that in the national level, we see, too many new protectionist measures are introduced. Also, fragmentation of the world trade system is the problem. We, of course, welcome the transatlantic trade investment partnership, trans-Pacific partnership, other interregional free trade agreements in ASEAN, for example. You know that 5 countries in the territory of former Soviet Union established Euro-Asian Economic Union, but at the same time we see lack of cooperation between these partnerships, economic unions, etc. It's necessary to increase the role of G20, at least not to coordinate, but to organize at least exchange of information and to harmonize the processes. I would like also to mention that for G20 it's absolutely necessary, to concentrate the agenda, to consolidate agenda. We see now in the G20 agenda very wide range of issues with different degree of urgency. It seems to me that G20 and the other international institutions would benefit from a more focused agenda with clear coherence across policy areas. And also, I would like to mention the necessity to solve some problems in front of us by more strong institutionalization of our activity. For example, Mukhtar Kent is chair of IBAC. IBAC was established by Turkish presidency, but we don't know future of IBAC during Chinese presidency. But it would be better to know how the process of interaction between B20, G20 will be organized not only in the concrete year, but in midterm. And also it would be better to know how the process of our interaction with the leaders will be organized. For example, in St. Petersburg, B20 met leaders. We met 12 leaders, because it was not the formal part of the agenda, but informal part. In Brisbane last year, as I remember, 6 or 7 leaders attended. It would be much better if our meeting with leaders and our discussions on our recommendations will be organized in more formal, more institutionalized level. Of course, we understand that there are too many outreach groups, including think tanks, G20. We used already all letters of alphabet. But in any case, B20 is one of the most important outreach group, and I believe it would be possible to, during even Turkish presidency, to have our meetings with leaders as a formal part of the leaders' agenda. And final point is that it seems to me that G20 mechanism is very good to exclude the economic tools and measures to reach political and geopolitical goals. Thank you.
Thank you. So far, we talked about very big picture, high-level things. Let me get to Mr. Kent. Muhtar Bey, you have been given this almost impossible task of advocating for the B20 recommendations this year as the chair of the International Business Advisory Council. Please tell us what will be your priorities.
Thank you. And in the interest of time, I'll be as quick as possible because I know we're standing between you and the dinner, and we're running a little late. So basically, what I would say is the International Business Advisory Council was formed for the first time, as you heard, by the Turkish presidency. There were two innovations. One was the formation of the SME, permanent SME center that's going to be based in Istanbul. The second, which you've heard about, the second was this International Business Advisory Council. The International Business Advisory Council had the task of identifying from each of the countries of G20 2 or 3 very prominent business leaders that could come and work as a group for a number of things. One is take all the work that was done by the 6 working groups, synthesize them, summarize them, but more importantly, simplify those into 2 or 3 or 4 groups, no more, and then form in each of the countries advocacies so that the G20 leaders could come prepared, knowing those are the recommendations coming from the different task forces. Again, simplification was the key. So after months of hard work, meetings in different parts of the world, there are basically 4 pillars that have been decided. Those are recommendations. The first one is recommendations to the G20 or leaders, G18 leaders, on the heads of state on employment recommendations. Employment recommendations targeted specifically at youth and diversity, women, gender equality in employment, women's labor force participation. And I won't go into the details, but obviously we all know youth unemployment is 60% in the Middle East, 45–50% in many parts of South Europe, and other parts of Asia, very high numbers. So this has to be dealt with, as well as women participating in the labor force. There are many groupings around that. I'm not going to go into the detail. The second is recommendations around improvement of trade. We've heard unemployment is at all-time high, commodity costs are at all-time low, interest rates are at an all-time low, and investment is going down. This is a truly bad picture. One of the lowest hanging fruits in the world today for G20 leaders is to decide to take the ratification of the World Trade Organization Trade Facilitation Agreement. Many different algorithms and algebra have said to us, including OECD's recent report, if this was done, if what the trade ministers of the G20 agreed to in Bali in December 2013, i.e. to ratify the Trade Facilitation Agreement, is actually ratified by all countries, accepted by all countries, that it would improve trade quite dramatically. That it would also, basically, the Peterson Institute in the United States said that it would add 21 million jobs. So it's a low-hanging fruit. This is one of the second recommendation. This third, and really, there is no excuse for not taking the decisions for this. As my good friend and an IBAC member, Maurice Levy, said today, the world is watching. Everyone in the world is going to see pictures, press conferences after Antalya in November, and then they're going to be looking for action. Because at the end of the day, especially the youth in the world, they are extremely cautious and extremely untrustworthy of large organizations, because they basically have not seen the algebra between decision and action. And again, we don't want this to be the same. That's one of the key recommendations, key cornerstones of the Turkish presidency is implementation. So the third recommendation is infrastructure. Again, very simple, low-hanging fruit in infrastructure. There's a huge gap. You've heard different numbers, $60 trillion, whatever the number is, even if it's $25 trillion, that gap has to be closed. Gap has to be closed in the interests of generating growth and employment, but also there's a social piece to that. And the final is SME financing recommendations, which we've heard so much about. And then there's a common thread that connects these, and that common thread is the golden triangle: more public-private partnership between government, civil society, and business. Business has a role, government has a role, civil society, universities, NGOs have a role. More collaboration, not duplication, but more collaboration will yield better implementation and better results, which connects all the four pillars. So that, in a nutshell, is the summary of the output of the IBAC, and that's what we are going to ask every member of IBAC from each of the G20 countries to go back to their countries in the next 2 months until Antalya, make sure that the political leadership is aware of these. And then also, the second thing is what my good friend Alexander said, and that is we need to be sure that the advocacy is such that the government political leaders that come to Antalya are aware of the need to meet with business leaders. Because that really will show the commitment for this golden triangle to succeed, of business government, closer collaboration between business government and civil society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the business community is looking forward to IBEC's efforts until Antalya. Let's look at the future now. Amar, let me get back to you. This year was a milestone year for global governance. In Addis, in July, there was this big conference on the development financing. In September, there will be the Sustainable Development Goals announcement in New York. And lastly, there is the Climate Change Conference in Paris in December. So a new stage is being set. What is the G20's role in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the surprising things is, given that this is a milestone year, you don't hear more about it in the corridors here. So I think it's extremely important to recognize that this year world leaders will meet in exactly 3 weeks and adopt an agenda that is no longer about poor countries and rich countries. It's a universal agenda. It sets the global aspirations for the next 15 years. It says we want a world where we want to eliminate poverty, but more importantly also we want a world that's a better life for everybody, and we want a better future for our planet. And it lays out a whole bunch of areas of action. And the G20 has a very important role to play, because ultimately if we are going to implement that agenda, the G20 has two contributions. First of all, it accounts for 65% of the world's population, 80% of the world's GDP. So what happens in the G20 countries itself will make a huge determination on that goal. And second, it's of course the driver of the global agenda. So I think a much closer and better connection between the G20 agenda and this more broader agenda is something that's very important. And I think it's extremely important for the Antalya Summit to consider exactly what the G20 will do in support of this agenda. So that's number one. The second thing I would say is that the G20 has been missing on the climate agenda. Okay, I'm just being a little provocative, just to push the boundaries. We heard in the previous session, we heard right now of the central importance of infrastructure. And I, for one, totally buy into it. If you think about the magnitudes of investment that are needed in infrastructure, calculated by the OECD, calculated by us, calculated by other groups, it's in the order of somewhere between 50 trillion and 90 trillion over the next 2 decades. I want to put that in perspective. That is more than the entire stock of infrastructure capital in the world right now. Why is that? Because we are in a kind of a defining structural moment. In the next 3 decades, there will be 3 billion people moving into cities. There is huge structural transformation needs in the countries, not just in China, but in other emerging markets and developing countries. So the footprint of this infrastructure will have a determining impact on the world's climate and environment for decades and indeed the century to come. Yet, if you look at the official work of the G20, even if you look at the work of the B20, there is relatively little emphasis given to the sustainability dimension. Why is that so important? Because if you look and you look at the environment in which these decisions are being made, they are fundamentally distorted. Fossil fuel subsidies completely distort investment choice in infrastructure. There is no carbon price. The price of coal, which should be $200 per ton, is $50 a ton. So it's extremely important to think about what are going to be the mechanisms that ensure that we not just build the infrastructure, but we build a better infrastructure. This has been emphasized by former Deputy Prime Minister Ali Babachan, but translating that into an action agenda for the G20 is something that is work still to be done. So this is one area that I, at least from my side, I want to put on the agenda. I think in closing, let me say that there are 3 areas drawing from this conversation that we heard and building on the 3 I's that Turkey has put forward where the G20 can do better. The first is implementation and accountability. I think the G20 can still make improvements on seeing how do we get implementation, not of actions of just one G20 presidency, but of commitments that are made cumulatively and an accountability system for that. The second I that I think the G20 needs to do better on is innovation. Very much in the same way that was just mentioned by Marcus. Not doing it itself, but ensuring that we are identifying good ideas that Muhtar Kent mentioned, and ensuring that those are supported, particularly at the time when they need to get legs. And the third I, which the G20 needs to do better, is inclusion. As I mentioned, there are 3 aspects of inclusion where I think the G20 can do better. One is it needs to empower and strengthen universal institutions so that they can perform their role. And the fact that we have not yet delivered on IMF reform is a good example of the G20 not being able to deliver as ambitiously as it could. Second, it needs to ensure that the 172 countries that are not at the table, and yes, including Sweden, is well represented at the discussions, and finding smart ways to do it, and also to ensure that without making a huge cumbersome mechanism using networks of networks, and the B20 is a very good one to try and ensure that we have a more inclusive G20 in the future. And I have to give credit to Turkey because there have been some very important strides over the past year. So let me end with that.
Thank you. So let's go a bit beyond the sustainability agenda. Marcus, I want to get to you with this question. President Erdogan actually in his opening speech mentioned how G20's agenda could evolve beyond economical and financial agenda that is the current focus. He talked about immigration, he talked about peace, and he talked about how G20 should touch everyone on the street. So what's your take on that? How can we improve G20's agenda beyond what we are discussing now?
Well, I'm certain that the agenda can be improved. I think that in the interest of all humanitarian questions, of course, it's very tempting when these prominent leaders meet that they will not only talk about finance and economy, and it's understandable, of course, with all the pressures on the refugee agenda, with all the humanitarian situations that have come in the wake of that. Of course, it's very, very tempting for G20 to take on the peace role, which is, of course, also necessary to create the confidence that we need in going on in various business endeavors and relations between countries. And Amar, I would also absolutely suggest and support your idea around climate change. I mean, that is something that if we don't deal with it, our kids will have to do it for sure. But I would still come back to the question of implementation as perhaps the most important question right now for creating the confidence around the G20 agenda. Let me take an example. The G20 and the Financial Stability Board and the Basel Committee was extraordinarily quick and quite effective in addressing some of the financial risks that came out in 2008. However, in my view, one should come back to the question about calibration of the banking regulation that has come up in the wake of all that regulatory work. And I say that because at the end of the day, with all the very important political items that come up, of course, on the G20 table, a functioning economic system, a functioning financial system is of the utmost essence. And for the persons on the street and for the businesses that operate around the world, implementation of a financial system that actually also contributes to economic growth, to employment, to innovation, is absolutely necessary, in my view, for G20 to be viewed as, from the larger masses of people, as a very, very important factor. If that works, if the financial system is actually providing the support for economic growth, financial stability, etc., then we can also address items like climate change. Because, as has pointed out, perhaps one of the most effective ways to address the climate issue is actually to find the financing for new sustainable infrastructure, new sustainable energy sources, which will provide jobs by itself. And these are quite simple methods that has to be addressed, in my view. And as we look at it right in this moment, we have to recognize that we are still living in rather uncharted territory when it comes to the financial markets. Substantial liquidity in the markets, very low interest rates, lots of nervousness, and a banking system over the years that have been put on a regulatory regime that actually makes it more difficult to finance long-term infrastructure than it was before. So to me, it suggests that we come back to the implementation question and that we have to go back to the roots of some of the fantastic issues that G20 tried to address, but perhaps didn't see the final goal. And that would be my suggestion.
Thank you. So my take from your remarks is that finish the current agenda, implement it before getting into new issues. Muhtar Bey, I have another question for you. Employment is one of the relatively new items on the agenda. you said twice in the previous remarks, I don't want to get into the details about employment, but it would be great if you could get into the details and discuss how technology affects employment, how G20 can better tackle the youth unemployment issue, which is very big both in the developed and developing countries now, and what is B20 thinking about that?
I mean, I think, again, not to get into too much of the weeds, but recently, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Recently, a lot of work has been done on these topics in various institutions, whether it's Brookings or whether it's the World Economic Forum or whether it's other places. I was the head of a task force at the World Economic Forum on youth unemployment. And you heard from previous panelists about the importance of apprenticeship programs, the importance of two-year educational programs. And then the other important aspect is again, coming out of some of the recommendations of the task force, is subnational government. The importance of working not just with national leadership, but subnational governments act like business leaders. They make decisions, they act quickly, they talk less, and they are much more do tanks as opposed to think tanks. And so I think the importance, again, is for business to work with mayors, governors, intelligent incentives related to sustainable development, better for the environment, better for business, water-saving programs that save costs. In my company, I've gone water neutral globally this year for the first time in our history, and that saves me costs. Good for the planet, good for cost. I mean, there's nothing that, you have to find the juxtaposition though. It can't be, the innovation is making sure that it's not a charity. And so all these are going to, if we work with the right set of recommendations, have government and business collaborate with small town mayors, large city mayors, and again, if you take the 20 largest cities in the world, they account for 45% of the GDP of the world. Let's go and work, have the national governments and business work with those cities to not just on a national basis, but city basis. And that's when I think we will see results happen. In Switzerland, and Germany I think is the same, our colleague from Germany talked about it very gracefully. 45% of the CEOs in Switzerland don't have a university degree. They basically have had two-year educations or vocational, they come out of vocational training programs and then get their degrees later. So the solution is not always a four-year degree, an MBA. There are so many different ways that we can intelligently create the right kind of skills. Fostering skills and entrepreneurship is going to be one of the cornerstones for youth unemployment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we discussed a large set of failures of the G20 and what could be done to get achievements in those areas.
I try to mention some failures. It seems to me that for G20 and for B20 as well, it's necessary to focus on the core policy points in the agenda. It seems to me that it's more easy to establish investment hub and SME forum than to, to reach positive results from the policies, which we discussed with leaders and which we discussed in the framework of our B20, IBAC, task forces, etc. And I absolutely agree that with my colleague that accountability is a very important issue. I mentioned the numbers that we have more than 1,500 commitments. After Antalya, we will have additional 100 or more commitments. But it seems to me that we sometimes we forget about the previous commitments. We are trying to, to create new agenda, and that's why for us, for business community, B20, it's necessary to, to help leaders to organize some monitor process and accountability process. And I would like to repeat that we have tight agenda, because now we have two wide issues in agenda with different urgency and different sensitivities. And also I would like to repeat my proposal to have more institutionalized mechanism to work with outreach groups. It seems to me that for Turkish presidency is a good chance to reach very positive results in all these directions. So, good luck.
Thank you. So, a less number of working groups and more action, and better integration with the outreach groups. That's the summary. Are there any questions from the floor?
You want to have dinner?
It will be very hard to find such a distinguished panel again. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this very intellectual, stimulating panel. It was the best one of the day. The topic of the panel was governance, and a lot of the ball moved around. But the question that I would like to ask to any of the panelists is, the governments are accountable, but we are not, as business persons or business leaders, able to enforce ideas. So during the Antalya meeting, what kind of governance or accountability was the key word that Amar mentioned, I think. What kind of a scorecard can we ask or make of these government leaders to improve things? Because things are discussed, then everybody goes home, and we don't track, we don't benchmark performance, and we don't have a scorecard. So in terms of corporate governance, how do we rate the individual ministers and the governments? I think that's the key, because if we can pursue that, then we can achieve goals that all of you are seeking. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to answer? Amar?
Yeah, I think the metrics for accountability has to come from the outside, in my view. So yes, the G20 has peer review mechanisms, the IMF scores, the OECD scores, the structural commitments, but ultimately I think for greater accountability, we need to have a better set of metrics. And let me just start with what could be a very long list. But I think the starting point for the G20 right now has to be with growth strategies. How well are countries doing in terms of delivering growth strategies? That's not just good for them, but it is good in terms of the global agenda right now. And that includes, by the way, such things as trade contribution, embedding infrastructure plans. As the B20 has said, it's important for all countries to articulate country-based infrastructure plans. How well are countries doing on that? How well are they doing on their structural commitments? But the metrics for this is extremely important, otherwise you will be in airy-fairy land. So that's one area. I think the financial sector regulatory agenda is another area. And I also think it's extremely important, as Marcus suggested, that we be able to calibrate that. Because not all the regulations, we can say, have necessarily the consequences that were aimed. So we need to have the capacity to do that. So in the key areas of G20 action, we need measures of accountability within the group, but we also need it outside the group. Personally, I also think the business sector needs to think about frameworks of accountability. And this conversation is not just within the G20, it has certainly featured very, very prominently in the discussions of the SDGs and the post-2015 development. Just like countries need to leave a good footprint, I think exactly as was suggested, you can have good business and good corporate citizenship at the same time. The question is, how do you measure good performance against not so good performance?
Marcus?
Actually, to answer your question slightly, we did, because you know the B20 started in South Korea, I believe, and the years following that, we actually did from ICC a form of a scorecard. I don't know if we do it anymore. We still do. The ICC still does the scorecard to try to track the progress on what has been agreed on the G20, B20. The big challenge, in my view, is to connect between the B20 and the G20 in such that we set up goals that you could view as common goals. And I certainly subscribe to your idea that only the thing that gets measured will get done.
Muhtar Bey?
With everything that was said, I'll just add the following, that I think the B20 needs to make sure that it continues to stick to the same agenda, that not, instead of creating new items, stick to the same agenda and make sure that the IBAC and the B20 work hand in hand, transfer the progress, and just ensure that nothing new really is added to the agenda. In a way, the Turkish presidency just took the same agenda items, but just synthesized them in a more cohesive manner. Stay with the agenda so that the China presidency can focus on the same, not start with a new page, but start with what was committed to and what was done, and keep, and then the IBC, which hopefully will continue on the Chinese presidency and on to Germany with even much more and better leaders than ones here, that they can then continue to put the same kind of pressure and advocacy on the national leaders, but also sub-national leaders. And that, to me, really is going to be the focus point. And make no mistake, the world economy is probably at one of the most fragile points today, since 1930s, one of the most fragile points. And I think that puts added pressure on everyone to execute, to implement, as opposed to just talk. And I think, therefore, it's a unique moment for better implementation and better accountability. And we all, business can't go and be the only accountable, but business can certainly, business is the face of the pulse of the votes, because business is on the ground. And I think that's what we have to make sure that we play our role at this moment through the IBAC and through the B20.
Let me add one more thing. The Turkish presidency is actually developing an accountability framework that they will launch in Antalya, and each country is assessing each other, and there are certain concrete metrics. I think what is missing in that framework is the inclusion of the outreach groups into the
But I mean, like
accountability.
The TFA, not to ratify that is inexcusable at this moment. Yeah. That everyone, whether it's the institutions like Brookings or Peterson Institute or universities, have all said it's going to create 20 to 25 million new jobs. So, and they all agreed. They signed in Bali. Now, not to ratify it, that is, to me, the lowest hanging fruit. And not to ratify it is inexcusable. We can't let that happen.
A gentleman over there already took the microphone, so please.
Açık mı? Açık. Efendim, ben 60 yıllık bir sanayiciyim. Ve 3. jenerasyon Türkiye'de büyük problem. Firmalar çabukça kapanıyor, devamı sağlanmıyor. Acaba B20 ülkelerinde nasıldır? Bunu birazcık bize anlatırlar mı? Yani babadan oğula kalıyor, oğuldan sonraki jenerasyonda firma kapanıyor.
This was a very critical question, maybe not directly in the G20 agenda, but the opinions will be very valuable. The gentleman mentioned the problem of the family businesses, SMEs, when from one generation to the other, the takeover problem.
Evet, aile işletmesi.
Yes,
evet.
It's a big problem, and is it the same in other G20 countries? That's the question. And is there something that G20 could do about that?
All I would say is, as far as SMEs are concerned, we all agree They are the backbone of every economy. We all agree that they have to be fostered, they have to be incentivized properly, they have to be financed properly, and I think you can't avoid the generational issue of any company, small or large. I mean, I think here we have on the panel here one of the great family businesses of Europe, the Wallenbergs. And maybe Marcus can comment too, but all I would say is we should not be discouraged by the generational issue. Sometimes children will want to do something else other than what their parents have created. That's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is we need to create the right mechanisms for more and newer SMEs to flourish, start up, whether they're in small retailers, women ownership of SMEs, youth ownership of SMEs, and that is not, again, in the best place in the world today. Out of 10, I would probably say in G20 countries, that is probably a 3 today. We can do a much better job. And large companies like mine can do a better job too. And we are working hard at it to foster and promote smaller companies in our supply chains.
Marcus?
I mean, if you put tax issues aside, I would very much support what Mukhtar said about the question of generational transfer, because it's, at the end of the day, I believe it's very much a part of interest. I mean, ability, yes, but interest, number one, in my view. But I also like to point out that in my view, what I think we're seeing is that, I said earlier that I believe that it's not only a cyclical question that we're dealing with right now, we're also dealing with substantial structural changes in the economy. And at least in Northern Europe, you can see very, very clearly how there is a dramatic increase in number of new companies being developed with completely innovative ways of doing things. And I think this will put generational questions in the years to come as well. And I believe that this is something we should not worry about. This is something we should encourage. We should encourage this very strong wave of innovation that is made possible by technological change right now, and find ways to support these companies with finance and very competent people. That's going to be the number one.
One last question from the gentleman over there.
Quickly, just in the mission of sustainable development goals, some of G20 countries came far short in the conversation of finance for development in Addis Ababa. So what should be the G20 responsibility to finance the sustainable development goals, and what should be the B20 role on the sustainable development goals?
I didn't understand the question.
I think what should be the role of the G20 in financing the Sustainable Development Goals? My answer to you would be that a lot of the G20 agenda actually is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. Today, whether you are a rich country or you're a poor country, financing, in some sense, the social compact is a challenge. And doing it requires kind of new foundations of public finance in all countries. So I think it's very good that the G20, the IMF, and the OECD are focusing on not only how you mobilize the financing, but how you use it more efficiently. So that's, to me, one key element. The second one, and I'm very biased about it, is what Marcus Wallenberg mentioned. How do you get the financing piece so that you finance the right infrastructure for this intergenerational challenge that we face? So to me, those are the two big areas. There are other areas, sustainable agriculture, there's, the need for international tax cooperation, But if you look at the agenda, there is a great concordance between what is being talked about there and what's being talked about the G20. It's just that there hasn't been a very clear articulation of it.
Thank you. So, unfortunately, we have to finish. I'd like to thank all the panelists. This was a very nice discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all, and we will meet at 7 p.m. for reception and dinner, and tomorrow morning we will meet at 9 a.m. in another building, not here in this top building. The other building which is called Congressium. And today we will also have a possibility to follow whirling dervishes during the dinner. Thank you very much for your contributions.